Never mind. Good morning or good afternoon for some, and welcome to today's webcast, Mastering a Data Center Move, Tried and True Practice, brought to you by Datalink. I'm Chandani McDermott. I'm part of the marketing team here at Datalink and will be your moderator today. Before we do begin this webcast, I have a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A icon widget at the bottom and submit your question. We will be addressing all questions at the end of the webcast. All questions from this webcast will be captured. If you are experiencing any difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the help button below the presentation window. It is the question mark icon and cover common technical issues. You'll be hearing from several presenters today. They are Irvin Theodero, Data Center Transformation National Practice Director, Jivan John, Senior Manager, and Cherie Van Zoyveen, Principal Architect Manager. I would like to turn this presentation over to your first presenter, Irvin. Please take over.
Thank you, Chandani. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating in our webcast today titled Mastering a Data Center Move. So just before we get into the content, I'd like to formally introduce myself and my team. My name is Irwin Teodoro. I run the national practice for data transformation for Datalink. Joining us today from Datalink and will be presenting as well is Jivan John, who is a senior manager in our practice, as well as Sri Vasudevan, who is our manager and principal architect for our practice. We've been doing data center migration and relocations for some time now. The things that we'll be talking about today are driven from a strict and a pretty followed methodology. There are some flexibilities into the methodology, but the reality is this methodology has proven to be successful over the hundreds of data centers that we've moved. And it might be a little different spin from what you're used to, but we wanted to demonstrate what the methodology entails and some of the practices that we apply into migrating data centers. So, if there's any questions, please utilize the question and answer format within the tool today, and we'll be sure to answer any comments or questions that you may have. So I will get into the crux of the presentation, and I'll transition to other parts of my team during the course of this presentation. For us, our data center practice principles rely on mainly a few principles. And number one, we focus on migrating applications versus systems. In today's complexities and the demanding business SLAs that are inherent in organizations, it's difficult to move a data center how you used to move it as early as 2 or 3 years ago. You can't just shut down on a Friday, move everything physically, and hope and pray that everything comes up on a Sunday. Due to the complexity of the business and the ability to maintain uptime based on SLAs back to internal, external customers, we try to piecemeal the migration, and we do that by understanding what the applications are, getting a view of the application inventory, and then from there determine what the interdependencies are between applications. And as we start progressing through our planning, we want to understand the complexities of how they're intertwined and how they're intermixed, so that we can thus come up with how we're going to move this in groups and in waves, if you will. One of the other things that we look at as a best practice is not only understanding what the inventory of applications are and what the interdependencies of applications are, but also the mapping back to the infrastructure. So, for example, we want to know in our highly virtualized environments, where does that application reside on a VM? Where does it reside on the storage? Furthermore, what are the IPs that are associated with the application from a networking or accessibility perspective? So it's one thing to get the application inventory, understand what the dependencies are, but furthermore is to understand how the applications and the interdependencies map back to the IT infrastructure as a way of overall seeing how you're going to move it. One of the other areas that we also look into as a result of understanding the infrastructure is profiling the data. And what we mean by that is, is it going to be a physical move? Is it going to be a data migration where you're exclusively doing the bulk of the move over a wire or over the network? We want to understand what the data is, but more importantly, what's the profile of that data? And Jeev and John, who again is a senior manager for us, will be going into in depth on how we examine that. But one of the things that you should look at as part of the data center moves moving forward is your ability to do both a physical and an electronic move. Again, in today's highly complex and highly available environments, it's difficult to do a shutdown on a Friday or move things physically without impacting the business. So, as we're doing more of our data center moves over the last few years, we're seeing more of a blend of both. I would say at this point, 60%, 70% of the environments, there is a strong migration over the network, where in some cases we're not really lifting a physical server. At the end of the day, there's a targeted environment that we're landing to, and we're doing the bulk of the migrations over that network. One of the other areas that we've seen as a best practice as you're doing things over a network or over the wire, so to speak, is to understand the complexities of the data, how the data changes and things like that. But more importantly, be flexible around how you're going to move the data. There are times that we've gone in with a solution and we think it's a good solution on paper. Through all the planning and discovery, it makes sense, but we realize that through some circumstance, whether it be the network or again the rate of change or the way the database is, that our initial solution is not conducive to moving it. So we had to find other techniques or some other ways on how to move the data. So, as you're embarking on these initiatives, and a data migration or a migration virtually or over the network is a high component of that, be flexible with the data migration techniques that you use. It's not just an array base. It's not just an appliance base or a software base. As you'll see in one of the case studies, we actually moved the data center 4 different times for a particular client of ours, and we employed 7 different migration techniques to move that particular data center. So, we led down one path, but through the course of how we're moving the data center, we had to look at other alternative plans. So just be flexible with how you're migrating data. The other best practice or principle that we like to apply is a very strong governance around program management and project management of the total engagement. And as you'll find out through our methodology, and as you see through the course of this presentation today, you'll see a high element of project management and program management governance around how to build out a plan and the different measures that we take in order to manage a program effectively. We'll look at an overall engagement, and at the conclusion of the engagement, put about 75 to 80% of our effort into the planning, analysis, discovery side of the engagement. So, we like to say 75% of these types of engagements are around project management or planning. So, hopefully you'll see that throughout the course of today. Some of the things that transitioning into throughout the presentation here, some of the common risks that we see our clients fall into, or ways that we're engaged, is mainly around scheduling and resources. The downtimes are getting more strict. There's more adherence to schedule maintenance windows or freeze periods within the organization. So having to move a data center around those types of restrictions or policies could be challenging. I would say resources is probably one of the biggest challenges to moving a data center. It's never a function of, in most cases, expertise or skill set. It's more of a challenge around, the bodies or the people to do it. In most cases, your organizations are faced with keeping the lights on or running the day-to-day operations. Very rarely will you move a data center in your career, or very seldomly will you. The challenge that we see is it's just not enough resources or the time to execute. Some of the other things that we see are the facilities, where you don't have a new facility available, or you're rushing against time to build one out, or there's some business driver that have to be in a facility in a certain time. It can be challenging. So we see those as definitely higher risks. One of the other areas too is the amount of moving parts from a vendor perspective. Moving the data center is one thing, but think about all the different parties that are involved, and how do you manage all those different entities, whether it be your network provider, your solution provider from a hardware or software perspective, a facility side from an environmentals capability. It could be challenging to harness all the different moving parts, and how do you manage all those entities can be a daunting task. So we like to invoke practices around how to do vendor management when you're looking at 8 or 9 different areas of a data center, and how do you, I guess essentially a better way of saying it, how do you general contract that overall effort. One of the other things that you have to take into consideration when moving a data center is the business requirements or the business expectations of moving a data center. Whether it be releases during the move, or major initiatives that from the business side that dictate they have to have an infrastructure up and running, can be a very challenging aspect of moving a data center. Also, it's gaining the in accordance with that the downtimes and the scheduled maintenance windows, and adhering to SLAs can be a very challenging side of moving a data center. So we like to say that our methodology definitely addresses all these, and you will see that during the course of today is how we address all those different risks as part of a data center move. So at this time, I'm going to transition into Jeev and John, who will address our methodology and how we approach our data center moves from a more detailed perspective. Jeev, if you will.
Yep. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Erwin?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Good. Yep. Good morning, everyone. So this is Jeev and John. I'm a senior manager with the practice. We have been doing this for some time, as Erwin said, and I think the reason that we've been able to do it very successfully and minimize the risks for the customer is because Datalink has a methodology behind the data center relocations and migrations and everything that we do. So what I would like to do is walk through the methodology for relocations, for migrations, and then transfer over to my colleague Sri, who will take you through the details of that methodology. And then we'll conclude as to how the governance piece kind of ties into the whole thing to make sure that any issues that will arise, it's not a question of if they will arise, it's more of a question of when, how we deal with that, and what structures and framework we have in place to deal with those things. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the data center relocation methodology that Datalink has. The top band in the slide kind of shows the high level how we go about it from a program management perspective, discovery, analysis, planning, and execution perspective. And the bottom bands of those slides has the details that are in there. As I said before, it's very structured, it's very methodical. We have a program management that is very, very serious in engaging with the customer, with any third-party vendors that are involved, as well as Datalink personnel. We have a clear project charter, a plan that we actually work towards, and on a very frequent basis, the plan is updated. We actually provide action items for every meeting that we do. There's risk logs that are taken into consideration. And, in cases when escalations happen, we have a steering committee that consists of management from Datalink and from the customer side, and potentially sometimes from the third-party vendor side, who actually drive, issues and escalations towards resolution. A very detailed communication plan is laid out. We also have a very thorough quality management process, a QA process, where personnel who are not involved with the regular day-to-day delivery come in from Datalink. These are Datalink personnel. They look at this whole process and assess that we are meeting the expectations of the customer, making sure that you're happy, the customer is happy. And then we have very defined methods for change control. A lot of times, that actually requires some conversation. A lot of times, I know of customers who are change control to death, and we don't believe in that. We will work with you, and we are very flexible with changes. If it is within certain limits, then that will be absorbed by Datalink. But if it's a crazy change, then we'll have to talk about a scope change, and a formal change order will be started. So that governance process is, I think, the trump card is the key in actually getting a data center relocation and migration done. It is less to do with it's not about getting 4 or 5 people who know how to do the work from different places and put them together. It's about actually working with a team that has a governance together that can actually do the discovery, that can do the planning, that can do the analysis, and do the execution. So now that we have talked about the program management, the governance piece of it, let's look at the discovery and the rest of the processes. So in there, what we do is it's a very detailed discovery process, and Sri will go into a lot of the details around that. We look at the inventory of what is there. We decide, what needs to be decommissioned, what actually needs to be relocated, what needs to be migrated, what's the option that we're going to use for relocation of that workload. Is it a physical move? Is it a logical migration? Things of that nature. And once the discovery is complete, we go into the analysis phase where we look at the data that we collected. And I have to say that the discovery is 95% of the time a combination of tools as well as interviews. Because the tools can only get you so much. We use the tools to collect the data, and then we do interviews with the teams at the customer site to figure out the semantics around the data that we collected. And then, we actually, the goal is to put them into smaller chunks. Once we collect the data on all the applications, we want to put them into smaller chunks that is manageable. The other important thing that is worth mentioning is Datalink's methodology for migrating, moving data is from an application perspective. We want to make sure and ensure that there is minimal disruption to the applications, minimal disruption to the business as a result of this transition. So everything is dealt from an application perspective, and then we create what is called as application bundles that are chunks of manageable applications or highly dependent applications, and Sri will go into details of that. And so when we actually do the execution, this becomes smaller chunks of pieces that's very, very manageable, and that's the goal. The analysis phase is when we actually analyze all the data, and then in the planning phase, we create what is called as the move groups with the application bundles. These are smaller chunks like I talked about. We create plans around when we need to do that. We work with your change control process and your business process at the customer side to make sure that this is adhering with the policies and the processes that you have at your place. So you will notice that we are very flexible to work with your internal processes, and we will adapt to that. And that's another reason why we have been pretty successful. Some of the items that you see under discovery and planning are, if there is a data center build out. Let's say you are moving to a completely new data center. There's a build out that needs to be done. There might be Datalink personnel from our field services team that is involved with standing and building out the data center. The key about this methodology is that the same program manager who manages the entire move or the relocation or the migration can also be the person who will handle that build out for you. We'll also do testing at the new site to make sure that your infrastructure is actually ready to rock and roll once the data is ready to come in or once the old infrastructure gear is ready to be relocated.
Jeevan, can I just stop you for a second? Jeevan, this is Erwin. Can I just stop you for a second? I was just getting some comments and questions around the audio failing. So, Chandani, can you just verify that the audio is indeed working externally for our participants? I just got a couple comments over the wire regarding audio not being available.
Yep, for them to get the audio, it's just basically because it's feeding through the web, so they just need to refresh their browser. It should come out clearly.
Sorry, Jeevan. Go ahead, please.
No worries. So I see 3 responses that way. I just want to make sure that they're resolved. Thanks, Erwin, for that. It's important. All right, guys. So we talked about the governance. We talked about discovery. We talked about the planning. And now we come into the execution. So you have to understand that by this time, you have all your inventory discovered. You have your applications that are mapped. You have dependencies between the applications and the infrastructure components mapped. You have put them into smaller bundles that are of manageable chunks. Now, not only that, you also have a plan as to when those bundles are actually going to migrate or relocate, or there's various methods to do that. In the next slide, we'll talk about that, but we'll see what is the date for that. We'll also have a plan that describes who's doing what. What is the third-party vendor doing? What is a person who's providing physical labor doing? What is a Datalink consultant doing? What is a Datalink architect doing? Who's doing what? Everything is detailed in what we would like to call as runbooks. Those are very detailed step-by-step things. So it takes guesswork out of the game. It takes confusion out of the game and makes sure that everything is very deterministic and laid out very clearly. So on the day of the execution, there are some pre-migration tasks that we have to do. Many of them are done before, but a lot of that is done on the day of the move itself. And then we actually do the plan. We actually do the execution for which we have been planning so far. Whether it's a physical relocation or a logical migration across the wire or any sort of backup restore, any of that stuff, testing becomes very key. And we do that in 2 steps. Before we actually do the production migration and the cutover, we do testing to make sure that everything will come back up. And out of all the migrations and relocations that our team has done, it has been made very clear that no matter how many times we have done it for every single customer, there are special nuances, there are critical important things that are specific to that customer that we have to do testing. And as a result of that, we capture all those important specific steps that is required for each individual customer, document that in our runbook to make sure that when we do the production cutover, when we do the actual execution, those steps are taken care of, and we are very confident in doing that. And we have already verified that this actually works. And those are the high-level things. Once the migration is complete, there might be some activities that we have to do from a post-migration. For example, data scrubbing is one that is very common. If you are moving away from a storage that needs to be returned back, we scrub the data. There will be the runbooks that will be transferred to the customer, and then if there's any gear that needs to be retired or disposed, then we will take care of that. So I know I spent a little bit of time on this slide because this is the overall methodology that we have, and this is very important, that it's not just a technical exercise. Like Erwin mentioned, 70-75% of the time is spent in planning, and we cannot discount on the importance of that. It's very important to do the planning. It's very important to deploy the tools, collect the data, do the interviews, get the plan in place, and test it to make sure that on the day of the move, on the day of the execution, this goes very, very smoothly. Okay? So moving on to the next slide, these are the methods, and I know I alluded to some of these while talking to you about our methodology. It varies from the top, pick up and ship, which is a most disruptive method that we can think about, all the way down into logical data migration, which is data migration across the wire that typically is least disruptive. In between, there are a couple of things. There is a shutdown and restore. There might be a backup and restore option that we can do. And you can see that each method has its benefits depending upon the application, depending upon the change control, depending upon how long it can be down, and depending upon how long a distance that this data has to travel. Like Erwin mentioned, we had a data center that we moved for a customer 4 times, and we used about 7 different methods to migrate. And in talking with the customer, they said that it's not about the tools, it is not about the technical piece of it, but it's about the flexibility. We analyze one option, and we find out that for certain applications that method cannot be used, and we have to be flexible enough to use a method that actually works for that application. And it could be because of like a variety of things like I talked about, change control, downtimes, what's the distance, things of that nature. Application failover, the third one that you see in the slide there, that's an interesting one. A lot of customers already have methodologies that you have for disaster recovery, for business continuity, where you can fail over a single application or sets of dependent application to a second data center. That's actually really good, because if you have a process that works, like I said, Datalink will adapt to that. We don't have to rediscover the whole thing, and we will use that existing methodology for failing over to a new data center using the runbooks that you have. So as you can see, from the top where it's most disruptive with a pick and ship, all the way down to logical data migration across the wire is that what Datalink can bring to the table. And again, logical data migration can be of different flavors. You can migrate using host-based methodologies. It has its pros and cons. You can use appliance-based methodologies. Again, has its pros and cons. You have to be cognizant about, are you migrating from your own on-prem data center where you have full access, or are you migrating from a shared infrastructure where you might not have full access? It might be the co-location facility. So based upon all those factors, we can analyze which option we want to actually migrate the data or relocate your existing infrastructure. So that is the various methods we deploy to move. Like we said, we have 6-7 methods to actually move the data, and it keeps building and getting better as we as new technologies and new methodologies are coming up. On this slide, I want to talk about the data migration process, and this is specific to the logical data migration that we talked about, which was the last bullet point there. Again, this is no different than what we talked before. There is a discovery process where we analyze, we collect the inventory, we talk to you, we deploy tools. There's an analysis process where we go through analyzing the data that we find out and we validate them with the customer. Then there's a planning process where we decide, okay, these are the bundles that we have created. What are the move schedules that are associated with each bundle? And each bundle, like I said, could be a single application. It could be a set of dependent applications, depending upon on what we find. And then we come into the execution process where we have a plan, where we have mastered it, where we actually do the testing to make sure that the actual production execution goes smoothly. And then there's a final testing. And like Sri will talk about it, but we do testing in various layers. At the network layer, at the physical layer, at the server layer, at the storage layer, at the database layer, at the services layer. The only place that we would actually ask the customer to be heavily involved in testing is actually in the application testing. And that is required because it is very difficult for a third party like Datalink to come in and get complete knowledge of the application in such a short period of time. So for application level testing, we depend on the customers, but for the rest of the things, Datalink will take that load off you and do it for you. Okay, so moving on, we'll look at the deliverables that we have, and these are some sample deliverables that we have for various projects. At a high level, we'll have an application discovery and dependency mapping document for you. We'll also have an application to rack mapping. This is important for physical relocations. We will have a current state assessment document that shows how your current state is laid out, how the cables are done, how everything is mapped up from a logical perspective as well as physical perspective. And then we will take that current state and we will map into your future state that you will have in the new data center. Whether it's a logical migration or physical migration, this is important. For physical migrations, we look at specific things such as power, cooling, how the racks are laid out. We use various tools to make sure that you have sufficient power and sufficient HA, high availability for power in the target data center. Design decisions is a single document where we capture all the decisions that were made for the migration, for the relocation. So that's actually pretty good, because if you ever want to refer back into why a decision was made in such a way, that's one single place to go back and look at that. Okay. The day of move plan is the detailed move plan as to, who does what. That actually contains the runbook. What is Datalink doing? What is the consultant doing? What's the architect doing? What is a personnel from the customer expected to do? What is a third-party vendor expected to do? So that is a day of move plan. And then the overall master project plan is a very important deliverable. This has not only what Datalink personnel and the customers and third party does, but if there is any contractors, anybody else from a co-location facility side or from a structured cabling side or from a physical cabling side, a physical labor side that we need to include, that is the master project plan that would be driven by your program manager. Network architecture deliverable is the other thing that we do, very important for physical relocations. And then the other thing is, back of the rack diagrams that we have. So as you can see, Datalink's methodology is very structured. It has a governance piece. It has a discovery analysis, planning, execution, testing piece to that. Those 5 things. And then we have various methods to migrate the data from data center A to data center B, or consolidating 2 data centers into 1. And then we own the deliverables that we will deliver to you as a customer, and that is what makes it very effective. Okay. The one thing that I want to tell you is the breadth of the team that Datalink brings to the table. This is a sample data migration relocation team that you have. As you can see, it's led by a program manager who manages the entire program But you can see that there are sub-project managers managing individual work streams that you have. And you have consultants, you have architects from a network perspective, from an application perspective, from a voice perspective, fiber channel storage, VMware. That is the breadth of the skills that Datalink brings to the table. And no matter what you say, this is important because there are components with Citrix, with security, with firewalls that is so important to make sure that not only is the data on the other data center, but your application is running and there is security that is being applied to make sure that only people with access gets it and people who don't get access to that. So that's the length and breadth of the team that Datalink brings to the table. And, I just wanted to say, like I said, the structured methodology, the various methods that we have to actually move the data, the deliverables that Datalink owns, and the people that we bring to the table. And most of these people, 99.9% of the time, these are Datalink staffed people, W-2s. We are very, very, very cognizant about that. So that is important to us. In the remote cases where we might not have one or two resources, then we will be open to going to the market and getting resources from that. But 99.9% of the time, these are Datalink staff resources. Okay? At this time, I would like to transition to my colleague Sri Vasudevan, who would take you through the details of the process, discovery analysis, planning, execution, testing, and give you more details on that. Sri, over to you.
Thanks, Jeevan. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. So the next few slides, maybe 15 minutes, I'll talk about the different components of the phases of the methodology that Jeevan went through. As you saw in a couple of slides back, discovery, analysis, planning, execution, testing. And then we'll go through the sequence and see what constitutes each one of these phases as we deliver and structure them. So the current slide shows an overall process of the discovery and analysis process. And as you see, there are 3 or 4 main components of this process. The first one is the actual data collection in an environment that we are assessing and trying to migrate the source data centers of that environment. The key to this phase is, in a lot of projects, we can collect data elements and in a representative manner and extrapolate information to some conclusions. But in this case, it is 100% of the environment that we have to gather, and it has to be accurate because it has impacts all over the place as we get into the later phases with planning and execution. So the data collection process is really well defined, and we typically create a data collection plan which is customized for a client or environment that we are working in. And the different things that we try to make sure that we get accurate data is we go through any existing data sources such as a CMDB. We may have discovery tools in the environment already, maybe something like a VMware capacity planner perhaps. There are other types of discovery tools that security and network teams use. We also use some specific tools. An example of that is ADDM, which will be referenced in a couple of these slides. But there are some specific tools that we also deploy to gather as much accurate data as possible on not only the infrastructure elements, which obviously there's discoverable data, and then there's subjective data that is available to people who are working in that environment. So that we try to collect that information along with specific application-related information through interview processes with subject matter experts. And overall, when you look at all of these different sources of data, it makes it a whole, and we are able to typically get accurate 100% data. And then when we get the data from all these sources, we have to correlate it, we have to normalize it usually, and then typically we have to go through a process of validation to make sure that what we collected, what's available, is current, accurate, and validated. So we talk to a few other people who have subject matter expertise into specific apps or infrastructure, network infrastructure, or server storage infrastructure, those kind of domains, and then we validate the data that we collected through the sources. And once it's validated, it's usually run through an analysis process which creates a grouping of applications that, based on metrics and specific profiles of that application or of an application, we create the bundles of application that Jeevan alluded to a few minutes ago. Those constitute really how the move groups are defined and what goes together and what goes when and why it should go together. That is the bundling process. And the data collected also feeds into a migration strategy and options analysis process where we define how we're going to move some of these applications. How do we move their platforms, and how do we move the data that drives these applications? If there are databases, how do we move those? So overall, all of this comes together in this process that is defined. And the output of this is really we create migration groups of applications that migrate together, bundles. We have a migration strategy that comes out of it, and eventually drives a migration calendar of events. Moving on to the next slide. This essentially summarizes the approach that I described. You collect some baseline inventory data. You create a data collection plan that shows us which are the data sources available, where are we getting data from, who's going to validate the data, how do we, what are the elements that are critical for that environment, etc. The application information, we conduct workshops that provide us that. We also talk to the infrastructure teams that I described a few minutes ago. And the next slide basically summarizes in a little bit more detail of what is the flow of this process of data collection itself. So we do the interviews, we do the discovery, we do the document gathering, reviews, we validate it, and then we drive into a bundling process. So a little bit of a summary slide here. And some of the components that are critical to a success of this is, we absolutely have to get server data. Obviously, what servers are hosting what applications. So there's a application to an infrastructure map kind of thing. So there are storage elements that we need to collect to clearly map out the application and the storage dependencies. There are network security, firewalls, proxies, all those kind of infrastructure elements that we also have to collect. And essentially, an application and an application stack that depends on a lot of infrastructure elements for its successful running smoothly. We have to map all of that from a detailed level so that when we actually move an application, one, we understand what the infrastructure dependencies of those applications are, but we also understand any application-to-application dependency. So all of those elements from the infrastructure, we have to collect and map it back to the application that is being hosted using those infrastructure elements. The bottom half of the screen just shows, we have a tool that is an example, ADDM, with a couple of other tools that do it. It's a discovery tool first, so it goes out, crawls the network, gets all the elements that we talked about, but it also shows what those infrastructure elements are talking to, and what protocols and where, and what is the actual map of the application. So it helps us build a data flow of an application itself. So when we move it, we understand all the components of that application. And then, all of this goes into a migration data repository that we use to analyze. Moving on to slide 14. Some of the typical application interview questions that we like to understand is, obviously, the outage tolerance of an application is one of the most important things we try to understand. So when can an application not be down? There are certain times when an application will have no tolerance for outage. It's critical to understand those kind of, availability and outage tolerance metrics. RTOs, RPOs, So it highlights criticality of an application. So the migration strategy that we develop is a little bit more sensitive towards those type of metrics. There's a lot of times applications that are especially homegrown have IP addresses hard-coded. We have to understand those, and it's not always easy to discover it automatically. So those are some of the application interview questions that drive answers to those kind of questions. Accessibility, number of users, so impact analysis, if you will, is also one of those things. And finally, firewalls and proxies, I mentioned, it's one of the main things that breaks when you move from one place to the other, especially if the network scheme changes or, you're moving from a flat network to a more segmented, restrictive network. And it's absolutely imperative to map that data flow of an application so you understand what are the different things that it depends upon. And if any of those elements are changing during this move, then it's very critical to document those and solve them during the move. This slide just kind of summarizes that the DC2 Project Team is basically the center point for a program like this, and we initiate a lot of conversations with application owners, infrastructure teams, external vendors, anybody who participates in a specific application stack and it's functioning. We pull them all together, get all the data, get all the analysis done, and we act as a central point of managing this conversation. A little bit of detail on the actual analysis phase. The analysis phase typically includes we got the data, so we review the data elements for dependency factors. I talked about application to infrastructure dependency, application to application dependency. There are interdependency factors. Some applications require data that is fed from other applications for its functioning. We have to analyze all of those things, and it helps us create a grouping of applications that have to go together, essentially. The analysis phase also drives migration strategies, any options, constraints that we may have. Certain times applications cannot be down during a certain hour. Maybe, the first week of a quarter, you running a financial report, you can't migrate an application during that time. So specific packaging and bundling criteria that is customized for a specific environment. We look through those factors, talk to the client, and understand which factors are important for them. There are certain scheduling constraints that we discuss. All of those things go into the planning stage. One of the things that, as the slide shows, is that application mapping that we perform towards a bundling. So I'll go to the next slide, which shows the overall bundling process that we conduct to arrive at the group of applications that we migrate together. Just some of the key packaging factors, bundling factors, are one, shared dependencies for applications. So there are environments where multiple applications share the same infrastructure, server perhaps. They could even be on the same set of storage LUNs. They have other kinds of infrastructure dependencies that they share, and it's critical to understand those shared dependencies before you can decide how many applications have to move together for them to keep functioning. If they miss one of their components while you migrate, there's a risk of outage to a specific applications that we moved. There are business impacts that we understand before we do a bundling. Interdependency between applications. I talked about downstream data, upstream data that different applications might share. We need to understand the impact of those, and if they're impactful, perhaps move them together. Sometimes there's only a limited amount of resources available to do a certain migration event. So we have to size not only the number of infrastructure items that we are able to move. For example, say I can only move 10 servers in a 4-hour window perhaps, or 50 VMs over a weekend. We got to understand those kind of size constraints. We also have to understand the size of an outage window that is available for a certain application or a set of applications, so we can schedule them in the right amount of time, and that outage window may also define the number of servers that can go in that period. Then there are the other factors that we have to look at is production and development / testing may move separately, so we have to understand the environment. There may be servers that are in failover configurations, which can be used as a strategy to move. And then, there are third-party vendor dependencies that we have to look at. Sometimes vendors have to participate in move events. We have to include them. We have to understand their availability, et cetera. Finally, I discussed this a few minutes ago. One of the critical things is that we have to understand network components, firewall rules, bridging, et cetera, that may constitute as an impactful exercise. So we consider those in our bundling process. Latency is one of the other things that we look at. Applications that could be latent and are dependent on certain infrastructure elements have to probably move together if the latency is an impact. And we talked about criticality. We consider criticality before we group them in certain applications. Sometimes moving multiple critical applications in the same window may not be a good idea, as it takes away focus. At other times, if applications that are critical are dependent on other applications, they have to move together. So we look at those kind of factors too. And the end result of all of this is a number of bundles that we create and say, well, these applications go together at this time due to these factors and these constraints. Moving on to the next slide. The planning phase is essentially to take all the bundles that we created and all the migration strategies that we created in the previous phase, and then build or work towards building documents that are used for execution. So for each move event that we define, we'll have an execution book. And the execution book contains not only the scope of that move, so all the servers and other things that actually move in that move, their move strategies. So essentially, we try to build a mapping of what do we move, from where, to where, and how. So that goes into this, that is built during this phase. Once we have defined that scope, we also define plans that are the day off move. So we are moving on a certain day. We need the detailed step-by-step sequential plan for that day of move. And it is detailed for almost every hour for the outage window that we have defined. But it also contains a lot of details for pre-migration activities. So anything that we need to prepare for that migration needs to be done. For example, if you have to replicate a large amount of data, we may need to start 2 weeks prior to the move day, and that is defined as a pre-migration activity, so we're ready on the day of the move. If there are certain servers to be rebuilt, we have to do it leading up to the migration day. So we've tracked that as a pre-migration exercise and make sure that on the day of the move everything is ready and we have all the necessary components that we need for that migration event. And these are fairly detailed, and in a lot of cases they also have the accompanying technical scripting or commands that we need to execute during that move day event to make it happen. So for example, if you're moving a SQL cluster, then all the things that we need to do, including moving quorum drives and DTC and all that stuff, is captured in a sequence that is absolutely critical for it to be successful. Or if it's a VM migration, then all the necessary steps, depending on the move strategy, is captured in a sequence. And finally, the execution phase. We go through. We have a command center bridge that we open. We prepare for the migration. We have a no-go decision, go no-go decision, and then we execute through the execution book that I just described. And then there's some post-migration events that are also captured in that document, so that the execution becomes an operational exercise. All the planning phase has captured most of the things that and discussed and agreed upon by the stakeholders of the execution. The next slide is just an example of how we create a process where we select how we do migrations. The bundle or the move group is the basis for this selection process. As we said, for each event we have a set of applications and their move strategies. But typically we have to look at certain factors. If a server is being rebuilt, it's a rebuild move. If we're just moving data and it's a file share type of data, SIFS, NFS, then we pick the right strategy for moving those files. If you have to move a server in a lift and ship or a forklift manner, then we have to pick the right strategy for moving its data while the servers are physically shipped. So all these questions we pose and we find the right, the correct answer for them in a certain situation, and it leads to the migration strategy for it. Some of the other things that we typically go through in identifying the right migration strategy is things like, for data migrations, do we need to do a block level? Is it a SAN migration? Should we do a host-based migration? The criticality of the app might sometimes define what we have, what strategies we have to use. It could be a single tenant, or in a multi-tenant environment, we have to use certain different types of migrations. Sometimes you have a multi-vendor environment with different types of storage devices, in which case, that drives a data migration strategy. We can use native tools. We can use third-party tools. So we go through an exercise where we define the criticality of the app, dependencies, and then things like single tenant, single vendor, block level, or is it file level, and then we arrive at the final migration strategy, which is discussed and approved. And finally, the testing phase. Jeevan talked about it. There's infrastructure testing that we perform. So all the infrastructure that we moved, we do a functional test that it's available, it's accessible, so database is online, servers come online, and then the application testing is the piece that typically the SMEs from the client environment or the application or developers have to perform, and each application has a different testing requirement that is built. I will hand it over at this point to Jeevan to conclude the couple of slides remaining and finish the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sri. So this is a capture of the governance piece that we talked about before. Program management is very important for the entire project for relocations or migrations. Initiation is important, your execution is important, your closure is important, but all the time you have to make sure that communication is done very seamlessly. Any miscommunications that happen are dealt with delicately, because this is a people process, this process, there's technology. We have to make sure everything is taken care of. The statement of work will be very detailed. It has all the steps that we need to do, the resources that are committed for this, what the plan is, how we're going to manage the financials of this, how the risks and issues are managed. The program manager will take care of all these things during the entire process. Okay. On this slide, I just want to talk about the various practice offerings from the Datalink Data Center Transformation Team. Like we talked about, we have a very detailed program management offering for the data center migrations. For other complex engagements that you might have, we might have some project management oversight that they can come and take it and run it for you. Also, we have project management residency program that we have in-house here, where if you need a project manager for any of your projects for a certain period of time, we can provide that. Coming down to the two main things that we talked about is data migration services and data center relocations. That's the core of the offering that we have on top of the governance methodology that we offer. Whenever you have a storage upgrade, when you have data that needs to be migrated for either for a SAN or for a NAS, to some place that Datalink's practice can actually come and help you. When you have a large-scale P2V or a V2V that needs to be done, we can take care of that. If you have existing systems like NetApp that is moving on to CDOT, or if you have existing, old type spinning disks that are moving into flash arrays that you see in the market or hybrid flash arrays, Datalink can actually help you with that. Going into the application space, Datalink can help you with the Active Directory integration, Exchange integration, specifically post-merger or post-divestiture, we can actually help you with that. There's also a large move towards x86 platforms from Spark systems, and we can actually help you re-platform that, run that whole project for you. From a relocation, we can do end-to-end, plan, design, manage the entire data center migrations and relocations. We can do that for you. We can even help you select co-location facilities with our site selection services option that we have in there. So as you can see, think about Datalink's data center transformation practice as an end-to-end comprehensive and complete solution provider for you that can help you from site selection, relocations, build out of the data center migrations, and even application integration post-merger and acquisition. Okay? Very cool. At this time, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about two case studies that we did. I'll be very brief through it. I know we are at the top of the hour. So let's talk about the first one. This was a medical healthcare provider based out of Toledo, Ohio. We went with the customer. We were providing their infrastructure storage in the beginning. We found out that over the years, they had acquired 6 to 7 different vendors of storage. So this is a good example for a data migration consolidation case study, right? The business demanded a very high uptime, and it was very difficult for them to keep up because the operational complexity was very high with the multi-vendors. What we proposed was a comprehensive assessment around their enterprise storage. We did an assessment and found that we have to have a strategy for the storage. We recommended a dual storage strategy with NetApp for NAS and EMC for block. Not only did we do the recommendation, we deployed, we installed, we also migrated all their NAS data and their SAN applications over to the new storage. And it's been about 9 months post that migration, the customer is actually able to meet their uptime requirement, their high availability requirement, and their operational complexity has gone down quite a bit. So I think the high-level takeaways from this was to think about enterprise storage from a strategic perspective, to understand what they need to do for the long term, and to know what the transition process and method to get from A to B is actually going to be, and use a partner who actually has done it and has the methodology to do that. So this is a data migration within the 4 walls of the same data center. Okay? The next example you will see is a more comprehensive one because this is spanning multiple data centers. This is a mobile communications provider, a device provider in Chicago. This company has been acquired two times actually, and the data center has been moved 4 times. So as a result of the first acquisition, they had to get out of their corporate building. This includes their storage, their servers, the entire IT, and the offices had to be relocated with a certain deadline in place. And they had very limited application downtime that they could have, very limited resources in the organization. The number of people that they had were very little. And, the new co-location facilities had very little access to them. And the timeline was very compressed, very aggressive. What Datalink's data center transformation team did was we came in, we assessed their entire infrastructure in a very quick pace. We deployed some tools, we collected data. Like Sri talked about, we created the bundles, we created the change controls, the plans, and then step by step, we actually finished their migration. We actually moved their engineering from the old data center to the new, and we consolidated 3 co-location data centers into 1 data center in the East Coast. So the good thing was, since we followed the methodology and our structure, this was done very methodically. We did run into issues, and that always happened, but all of that was dealt with because the communication plan and the governance was in place to make sure things didn't fall through the cracks. There were, there's about, like Irwin talked about before, there were about 6 to 7 different methods that we used: VDBs, PDBs, application migration, appliance-based migrations, host-based migrations, and this was a very successful project. In talking with some of the management, it saved the company multiple millions of dollars, in year one as a result of the consolidation and the migration that we were able to do. So those were a couple of the case studies that I really went through quick, and I guess at this time, we'll just pause and see. I'll pass it back to Shandani to see if we have any questions that need to be answered.
All right. We do have a question that came in. The question is, for application testing as part of the relocation, does Datalink have options or partners to conduct this work?
Yeah, so Chandani, this is Irwin. I'll answer that. As far as the application integrity testing is concerned, it's typically held within the application specific areas of our clients and customers. What Datalink will provide is the infrastructure that allows capability for the application to run. So once we move an application or we move an environment, the UAT, or the integrity testing, if you will, of that application is typically done by our clients and customers only because they have the tribal knowledge or the specifics around how that application functions. And in some cases, I would say in half the cases, the applications are custom, so we wouldn't really have any outside knowledge on the applications unless it's more of a commercially available or a third-party based app. For the most part, we'll get the infrastructure migrated, we'll get the infrastructure moved for that application, we'll create the test plans and work with the application areas to come up with a very thorough testing plan. But at the end of the day, the checks and balances of the application, the integrity of how that application functions from a user or a task level is typically done within our customer side. Okay. Chandani, I think there was a couple other questions as well, and if I may, I'll state the questions and then we'll answer accordingly. So, I think there's some housekeeping questions as well. So there's a question, Chandani, on these slides. Are these slides going to be made available to the participants of this webcast?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned we'll have to get back to them on how we want to send that out to the customers or anybody who's on the webcast today. So the person who submitted the question, we'll get back to you on that. I don't know how they're normally distributed. So. Okay,
we'll follow up with the responder to that question. Some of the other questions that came in, Shri, if you can answer this, came in around application dependencies during your piece of the presentation. How important is it to do an application dependency mapping for moves that are physical in nature?
So all dependency mapping is critical, whatever the migration strategies are. The dependency mapping basically allows us to determine which applications must be together or move together so they function properly after they're migrated. So even if you do a physical move with a forklift, and if an application that is on a server that physically moved has some dependency that was left behind, it is still going to create an impact, possibly. Now, there are other factors that define that, but we go through that exercise and make sure that we understand anything that is dependent on another component.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came in, and Jeevan, this was in relation to your overview of the sample team. The question is, in your most successful projects, what did the transformation team comprise of and look like from a customer perspective?
So just to clarify, this is Jeevan. Is it the team that the customer had to bring to the table to make sure this went smoothly? Is that the question? Okay.
That's what it's reading like, yep.
Okay, so if that's the case, yeah, we can take it in two steps, right? So the Datalink team you already saw about, the project managers and technical architects. From the customer side, I think it's going to be, there's always going to be the need for executive buy-in, management buy-in for the project and support for escalations, number one. Number two, I think it goes without saying that the infrastructure team from the IT side of the customer side need to be involved for the various things that we need to take care of from a server, from a storage, from a Citrix, from a VMware perspective. Number three, since we are doing the migrations from an application perspective, because we are looking at how can we minimize the downtime to the business by doing this transformation, it is important that the application team be involved as well. During two phases is when the application team needs to be involved. One is during the discovery, when we ask the questions about what the applications are, what the dependencies are, and interview them. And the second place that they really need to be involved is for the testing for the applications. Like Urban talked about, we can do the testing from an infrastructure perspective, but from an application perspective, we need the help from them. I mean, if you look at the amount of time, it's somewhere between 3 to 4 hours in the discovery process that the customer teams have to spend with us, and then during the testing process, it's usually again about 4 to 6 hours a week. It might be varying based upon the time when we test it, but that's the constitution: executive management, infrastructure team, and the application teams that we have.
Okay, great. And then the last question that I have here is, what are the most important areas to look at when moving a data center over the network or over the wire? I'll take a stab at it, and if Jeevan or Sri you want to add to it, feel free to. But when we're moving data centers and we're hardly moving a physical server, if you will, and we're doing everything over the network, Datalink looks at probably one of four areas. We're going to look at obviously the network and the capabilities of that link between facilities. Oftentimes we get asked to move, considerable amounts of data. However, we don't always have the desired throughput to get it over in order to meet an SLA or to make best relevance use of the data. So, number one is looking at the network and the network bandwidth that's available to us. Secondly, is the rate of change of the data. We're looking at, if we get the data over, say cross country, and at one point, are we ever going to be in sync where that data is going to be relevant for somebody to use, I guess is something we're always looking at. Thirdly, we're also looking at the type of mechanism we're going to move the data, what's available. If there are any gaps in the native solutions that are inherent in our customer sites, we want to know what tools they're using today, and if there's any other tools that will help accelerate the data movement, we're also looking at that. But I think fourthly and most importantly, it's the amount of cutover or the amount of outage window we're afforded to handle the data migration or the online move. There are times that there's minimal outage windows, and we almost have to look for tools that are zero downtime in nature. Or there are times that perhaps we have a weekend. So it all depends on the length of outage that is afforded to us or any maintenance windows that we have to abide by as part of the SLAs or the data commitment back to the business. So those are the things that we're really looking at. And then I guess a fourth point, another additional point is perhaps the groupings or the bundlings. How much can we chew at the same time, so to speak, and how can we best leverage other migrations that have a similar profile or similar SLA back to the business, and how can we combine or accelerate in that fashion? So I would say, I give you 5 points. Those are probably the 5 that I would look at. Would be the network, the rate of change, the outage windows, the solutions that you're looking at, as well as how you can bundle and put together different ways. And Jeevan or Sri, anything else on that to add?
I would just say that sometimes some of these also factor into the move strategies we develop and finalize.
Yep.
So I'll say that, in the context of all of these, we will tweak our migration strategies and pick the right one.
Chandani, I believe
I'd probably,
Steven? Okay, I'm sorry.
oh, yeah. No. I'll probably add one more thing, and that's around security and access. Depending upon whether you own the data center or whether you have shared access to a co-location facility, and whether the infrastructure is owned by you or is it a service that is provided to you, we might be limited in how much we can do and what layers of the infrastructure we can access from a security perspective. So it'll be probably good to understand that going ahead, so we can be better prepared to address. But no matter what the situation is, we can do the migration because we can choose different methods. But the access layer should, it's a good thing to understand in addition to the things that Urban and Sri added there.
Yep, thank you. Yep. Chandani, I don't see any other questions. Is there anything else that came through?
Nope, there's nothing. But I do want to kind of mention the recording of this will be available on demand through on 24. But the presentation, we'll get back to you on the presentation if how and which way we're going to send that out.
Okay.
So, no other questions. I think we can close it off. So, thank you everyone for attending today's webcast. Thank you, Irvin, Jivan, and Sharif for presenting.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.